Welcome to CFO 4.0, the future of finance. The CFO role is changing rapidly, moving from cost controller to strategic visionary. And with every change comes opportunity. We are here to help you take advantage of this transition, to win at work, drive your career forwards, and lead with confidence. Join Hannah Munro, Managing Director of ITAS, a financial transformation consultancy, as she interviews key experts to give you real-world advice and guidance on how to transform your processes, people, and data. Welcome to CFO 4.0, the future of finance.
Hello everybody and welcome to this episode of CFO 4.0. Now, if you haven't heard this guest before, well, quite frankly, where have you been? We are on episode 5 of the PE-backed or the PE CFO Series, as we like to call it. So I'd like to welcome back onto the show, Richard Sanders, who is the founder and managing partner of Sullivan Street Partners. So welcome back, Rich.
Hi, yeah, good to be back.
So, and I should have that absolutely nailed. That alliteration caught me off guard. Obviously, not had enough coffee today already. But today we're going to talk about the good, the bad, the ugly, and all things private equity. So there's quite a few things that we can explore here. So let's just talk with the first piece about, how do relationships differ, I guess, when you get into a private equity world. There's a lot of, should we say, rumors about what it's like working in private equity. So what are some of the things that you encounter around, how relationships look before and after people go through that private equity transition?
Yeah, so I've worked in, because I think it's important context, I've worked in big corporates, so John Lewis Partnership. I've worked in small sort of startups. I've consulted to whole different types of private equity, and obviously we've run our own businesses at Sullivan Street. And so I've seen a lot of before private equity investment, a lot of after. And I think there's a huge variety of behaviours within the private equity kind of portfolio world. But there are some commonalities in the way that people are treated and the relationships and so on. Now, I won't go so much into relationship with investor director and the CFO. We've covered quite a bit of that in other episodes. So on a more general basis, I think there is a risk when you move into a private equity world that you move away from some of perhaps the founder-led type ways of behaving, where you have a good idea of what's going on at the front line of your business. You've got a lot of respect for everyone between the CEO and the latest recruit into the business. Because actually the businesses quite often can be tight in terms of numbers, and they're definitely tight in terms of managers looking up and down the organizational structure and trying to make the business work. I think there is a risk, and this sometimes happens in private equity, that actually the attention shifts to looking up the org chart to, the sages, the wise, the gurus and whatever within the private equity house. And that often is not helpful. That often doesn't serve the investor. And it's there's got to be this healthy blend of bringing in the discipline, financial discipline being one of those from private equity, but retaining all of that good operating discipline as well, the closeness of relationships, the stuff that's made the business successful up to the point it gets invested in, all has to be retained in order for the addition of a bit of financial rigor to really hold any weight. So that's there's a theme in there around actually people start to look up the organization and look for a lead from the private equity house. That's often not all that helpful.
So I think what we're saying there is that there's almost like a risk, and it's not a private equity driven risk. It's almost a self-driven culture change that happens when people move into that new private equity oversight. And so what as CFOs should we be thinking about as we go in through that transition? Because maybe that's the things that we should talk about now, perhaps, is what is the stuff we should retain from where we were, and what is the stuff where we actually private equity does do well, so we should pull that into the business. In your opinion?
It gives you some ideas about where they might be more right than wrong, right? Doesn't it? That's where you take the lead. So I think that private equity, start with the obvious ones. Private equity really great at reporting around clarity of governance, hopefully clarity of decision making and planning and strategy, those sides of things. And that is pretty common, I'd say, across all the different types of private equity. Those should be strong suits, right? Access to capital is another one that's a practical one. So if you're in that territory and someone in a private equity house is saying to you, I think we should do this, you should listen a little bit more. I think the areas where the management team will take a lead, and I'll come to the CFO role in a sec, is certainly around the culture of the company, the type of people that you're recruiting, the organizational structure. There might be a bit of advice on that from a private equity house, but actually, how the teams fit together. The power differences between the different levels and the characters of the folk and how that varies by country and all that. So you should be running that. The proposition that you're taking to market, the market and the competitors, you'll remain the experts in that. And actually what private equity will do, it'll give you the benefit of a benchmark across lots of different sectors. It'll give you some ideas about different ways that you might approach the same problem. But it won't necessarily tell you in any greater detail or to any greater effect about the nature of your own individual market niche. So that gives you kind of some safe areas. I think the CFO role is really important in this because the CFO in any business can help bring the strategy to life in the company. And that's by making sure you've got the right structure of reporting, the right cascade of objectives into staff. Some people think that's the domain of like the HR director. It's a shared responsibility across the whole of the exec, but the CFO can be instrumental in making sure that reporting, objectives, and kind of the ongoing support to make sure that you understand whether you're winning or losing in the area that you're meant to be affecting. The CFO can help that happen, bringing performance to life. So again, similar in this private equity situation, you can help make sure you've got the right balance here. You can see, where the lead is coming from. Now, 9 times out of 10, the lead will come from the executive and from the CEO, the CFO, the HR director, the sales director, and those people. So it should only be like 1 times in 10 that there is something coming from the private equity house. And outside of that, they're really just setting a framework for you over the 3-4 years that they're focused on for the plan. But the CFO, I think, can help navigate that and maybe put a little bit of pushback into the private equity house to say, actually, look, it's great that you're affecting positively what we're doing over here, but we need to take a lead over there, to sort of, sit on that fence, making sure that everybody's playing to their strengths.
And is there any things that, you would advise a company that's been acquired to really fight to keep? You've mentioned culture and hiring decisions and really making sure that they retain ownership of that. Is there anything else that you would say it's worth going to bat for to keep control and go with, keep that, I guess, company input on?
Yeah, it's a really important point here around control, which is you are the executive team. You actually have control, right? You are the private equity. There isn't a private equity house on the planet that doesn't want you to be accountable for delivering improvement with the business. So that means if they demand accountability, you have control. Now, the private equity house might have a route to take that control away from you. If you're not performing, you can ultimately get fired, can't you?
Mm-hmm.
That's the ultimate. But you do have control, so act like you do. But that means you need to go and take advice. To sound people out. A lot of what we've been talking about here is just good communication. So if you're not certain that you've got the right answer, or if you're not certain who's meant to be taking a lead on something, you ask. And just because you're at the top of your organization or you're now under private equity ownership doesn't mean that actually all the answers are clear or it's easier or anything else like that, or it shouldn't be collaborative. So you can just go and ask. Definitely do that. I think something that's a little window into perhaps a different way of thinking about businesses is remember that private equity house is around for one deal iteration. So there are some things that you might be sensitive to as an executive team where you're going to be around for the next maybe 10 years. It varies by person, but it might be the next 10 years, where Private equity cares for the next 3, typically. We care a lot longer than that, so we're really well aligned on this, but typically it's 3 to 4 years. So like recruitment for the next wave, the next succession plan might matter more to you than it does to the private equity house. What are you doing in terms of looking at acquisitions beyond the next 3 to 4 years? There are relationships you might want to foster there. There might be some R&D that you want to do that will leave you well placed at exit, so the private equity house would thank you for it, but might only come to fruition in the next phase, the next hold period. So I think there are naturally some long-term elements that you'll be good to think about soon, because the private equity house want that all in the memorandum that goes out when they're selling the business. But you might find that you're more naturally inclined to think about that versus the house that you're working with at that time.
And you've mentioned there about, not being sure where different things sit. So what do you see as the different hats that a CFO should wear within an organization, particularly when it's private equity backed?
Yeah, look, I'd start with saying, I think with private equity, the main thing is there are questions immediately about what can the CFO do, what can the CEO do, how does everybody play to their strengths? So one of the opportunities is you get to address that question fresh. You don't have to just go with how it's been working before. And we'll often inherit a business where there's been a founder in place and there are some things that are off limits and a CFO just can't do. Or the capital structure means there are some things that are off limits and a CFO just can't do them. When you team up, this is absolutely how we think about it. When you team up to work together on an investment that you've just invested in, it's a fresh set of questions, right? Who is best placed to go after a mergers and acquisitions approach? So that could well be a hat that the CFO is wearing. Who is running internal reporting, communication, and objective setting? Could be the CFO. The CFO will nearly always be running the finance department, but obviously there could be a finance director underneath the CFO or a strong financial controller. And I've had a regular conversation with CFOs saying, I don't want you doing the day-to-day accounting because there's too many other things for you to do. So there's always a debate there about the level of delegation from a CFO, because again, when private equity comes in, typically the CFO's got more to do than they can possibly do. But there's just a long, long list of things. And actually, if you get better leverage, you'll get through more stuff. So those would be some core elements. CFOs for me would often have IT under their wing. So like IT systems, digitization, definitely putting things in the cloud, automation, those can absolutely fall part of the remit as well. And HR occasionally does. Because again, in the mid-cap, it's not that you've got a board that's got an expert director in each of these areas. And particularly for back office, if you haven't got a dedicated senior director, it'll often fall to the CFO. So like lots and lots of hats there already. Before we get to like the strategist, some CFOs are strategists. Nearly all CFOs are the planners, and they're the people who will keep track on the budget. And again, if they're not, then it'll be someone in their team that they're delegating to. So, the list could go on and on. I could probably come up with 30 different hats. But it just tells you what you've got to do to navigate that is go in with something of an open mind and talk to the people around you about where you as a CFO are best placed to lead to the best value add within that phase of ownership.
So, and I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here, Rich. Well, how do you see the difference between a CFO and a finance director? Because I've had a few different conversations around this topic, and I think it's maybe worth bringing out since we're talking about the hats that a CFO plays.
Yeah, so I think what I'm about to say works in practice and also kind of against a definition. For me, an FD is definitely running the finance department.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So they are worried about invoicing. They're worried about cash flow. And I do mean worried. You need someone to worry about it. They are involved often in the budget, and they're involved in metrics and performance management, but they have to stay worried about the day-to-day. Right? The CFO has all of those hats we've just talked about, potentially. And in terms of finance, because this is the biggest difference, they've moved away from worrying about the day-to-day. They are worrying about perhaps the week to week, They are potentially holding the banking relationships, but relying on somebody else to chase invoices to do the day-to-day, if that makes sense. And it's similar to when you have a managing director and a CEO, right? So just to give you that definition, like a managing director is still hands-on, like he's still doing things direct. And a CEO often is working through other directors. And you can see how that's different. So you might have a managing director that's got a sales flavor and they'll still be doing some selling, or an ops flavor and they'll still be managing a whole bunch of direct reports around operations. But what they're therefore not able to do is to step away from that day to day as easily and come up with what's the vision and what's the plan. So both of those transitions, MD to CEO and finance director to CFO, and on the web, there'll be some great definitions out there, I'm sure, but that's how I would see it. So it's about leverage, about strategic vision versus day-to-day.
And I think it's great that, I guess, private equity see real value in that strategic piece versus the day-to-day as well. So there is actually, we talked a lot about some of the things to be aware of, perhaps, shall we say, as we go into private equity. But there's actually a real value in that strategic skill. So, for a CFO, so it's actually from a career perspective, you've got that opportunity to step up. But I guess you need to have the conversation about where is all of that day-to-day running of finance going to sit, and have you got the right team with you?
Absolutely. And I think the right order, or certainly the order that we approach that in, is you want to package that up. You want the stable platform of the day-to-day being under control through financial controls, good reporting, ideally some automation. And then everybody's got more time to be looking forwards. So a little window on this that I don't think we've covered off yet is actually when we step into a business, an early question is, when does the board report come together?
Yeah.
Right. And so however many days you are into the month that board report comes together tells you the number of days that the whole finance department is looking backwards rather than looking forwards, broadly. And so quite often what we'll do is ask the question, at least, if not move it, to say, well, couldn't we close after 5 days? Now, depending on the business, that can be really valuable for decision making. But what it's more valuable for is shifting everybody's mentality to be looking forwards rather than to be, bean counting in that really negative statement, right? Don't be a bean counter. But actually, if you're looking backwards and just accounting for what has already happened, and it's similar to FD versus CFO, you are not driving value creation, you're just measuring it, right? And it's obviously not that simple. But there's some resonance around that in terms of like where you're giving yourself time to be looking forward to be building something versus reporting, accounting, and looking backwards.
No, and I think and it's funny because I actually spent a lot of time having conversations with people about setting that benchmark. And out of interest, that 5 working days, is that a benchmark that you hold for your acquisitions and investments?
Yeah, I mean, don't tell anyone, but it's just a made-up number of days. But it's just where I start the conversation. And so sometimes it's like any transformation. You need to start with some idea of something, like just throw something out there. And businesses can do a 5 working day close.
Yeah.
Of course you can. You might have to compromise the accuracy on some of the line items. Last business I spoke to, they actually had to compromise some of their expenses management allocation. But you look into it and you go, well, does it matter? And the answer is no, it doesn't actually. It's not material. So of course, please compromise that, because then we can get the information sooner. So you just start off with a benchmark to agitate towards seeing what's possible. But you don't need it to be 5 days, hardly ever. You just want to make sure that you're efficient in the looking backwards versus looking forwards.
And I think it's a really interesting piece in that, like you say, if you're spending the first 5 working days figuring out how to close month end, you probably spent the 5 days before the month end trying to get to that month end close, haven't you? That's the reality. So that only leaves you 10 working days, say, to actually do anything that's slightly outside of that.
But you're jumping to exactly the right thing. So as soon as you switch to this mentality, you're then looking at what your month end is going to be before the month has ended.
Yeah.
Right. So again, in different businesses, so we have facilities management business, that when we did this change, it meant that we started looking at labor in a different way. and we started projecting labour versus revenue, and at a point where you could still do something about it. So you could go, actually, look, who's booked onto which shifts? And it's like, oh, gosh, like this region's got a problem because they've got more people than work.
Yeah.
Or problem the other way around as well. But it means instead of then saying after the month end, that happened, you're looking at it going, we can avoid that happening. So you really do quickly move into, like a silly example maybe, but there are lots of examples where you then, with this mentality shift, suddenly start driving the value on the short term as well as in a visionary sense over the long term.
So for me, one of the most important things about any transformation project is the partners that you work with. And whilst I'd love to list off a whole host of reasons why ITAS is the perfect partner for your transformation project, why don't I let our customers do the talking for us?
One really good thing working with ITAS is it's dramatically reduced my blood pressure. Obviously, an account system is critical to anyone's business. So innovation data, without that, like every company, we couldn't function as a company. So, it's one of the most critical pieces of software, and any sort of vulnerability we have with that sort of keeps you awake at night. And now working with ITAS, I don't have any concerns about our accounts functionality and our account system and the usability and all of that. Working with previous partners, I've got some grey hairs and sleepless nights from that, as I say, because it's so critical. So it's been an absolute pleasure, and long may the relationship continue.
And you mentioned, obviously, all joking aside, the 5 days being plucked out the air. Is there an ideal in your perspective? Is that 5 days about right? When you make that shift, you suddenly get that sort of headspace changing? Or have you, I guess, what's the range that you've seen? Like the really good teams versus...
I always thought it's what you resent, right? So anything over half the month, and I just feel like you're looking backwards more than you're looking forwards.
That's
right. So that's kind of one benchmark. The 5 then is something we've got a few businesses who are doing that. So I think the answer is somewhere between those two. And if someone continues to say it's going to be like 28, 29 days, the question back has to be, well why? And if that continues to be the case, then, well, how important is that last month's result?
Yeah.
Right, because that can be the case. It can actually be, it's more important that you look at the last 3 months as a kind of rolling average. So you might have a think about that. But yeah, if people wanted to walk away with 2 like benchmark time periods, I'd say 5 days and half the month would be the 2. It's got to be somewhere in between those 2. Otherwise, it's somewhat unacceptable.
Yeah. Oh, it's really interesting. So I remember working with an organization. They took 6 weeks to get their reporting out, and I'm like, your month is you're not even looking 1 month backwards. That's like a month and a half. And it was actually really amazing once we got it down, and we got the calculations. But that's the point, isn't it? If you, like you say, it's the mindset that the speed of that reporting gives you. You need to be able to look, to be able to react to the change. You can't be 6 weeks behind where you need to be.
You tie yourself in knots around this stuff, right? And I know what ends up happening is you end up getting to spurious levels of accuracy over stuff that doesn't matter.
Yeah.
Like you must do if you're taking that amount of time. So, I mean, in that example with a 6-week reporting period, and I've seen the same, when you sit down to talk about performance, you'll spend every second sentence reminding yourself about which month you're talking about. It'll be the most like disjointed, like uncoordinated. Even if you've got your head around it, it really is counterproductive to have it be at that delay. You're better off talk sooner around a flash result.
Yeah.
Even like that would be much, much better. And again, sorry for everyone, but that's kind of just the basic requirement from private equities. You've got to be looking forward. You've got to have performance under control and report it on, quicker than that. Yeah.
And I think that's good for, it's good to set that expectation, right? In terms of, you need to go into them. You need to, it's somewhere between that 5 working days and that mid-month, you need to be ready and potentially flash reporting quicker. Let's be honest, right? That's we're talking about the closing of the month here. You need to be able to pull weekly. Our set is normally what we like to work to is weekly flash reporting, but you need that speed as well. So
yeah, absolutely.
So you mentioned something earlier, which I just want to sort of loop back on, and that kind of short versus long-term thinking. So if a PE company only has, like you say, that 3-year cycle, 5 if you're lucky, depending on who you're working with, how do you find the balance, I guess, between making sure that you are focusing on the longer term and doing what's right for the business versus, I guess, not placating, but keeping your current investors happy? So have you got any tips and tricks that people need to think about with regards to that?
Yeah, the main thing is, remember, you're actually nicely aligned on this. So an investor director might be really concerned about, next 3 months, next 6 months, depending on where you are in the deal cycle.
Mm-hmm.
But if they do not have like developments coming for the point of exit, there'll be a problem when they're going out trying to excite people about buying the business.
Okay.
So you are nicely aligned. This is just about relative priorities, and often about how much time you spend in a board meeting or a strategy day talking about these different time periods. So you are aligned. You're not in conflict. It's just making sure you've got the right time allocation. So I would be doing things like just reminding private equity house that we're going to have some messages at exit. We need to stay on top of the way that the market is developing. It's really thinking about, particularly on things like CapEx and R&D spend in terms of actual development spend. What do you have to do to keep up with the market? And then what are the optional elements on top of that? And what's the return on investment for those things? And that sometimes is where this comes into sharp focus, like the difference in the time period over which people care. And you rightly will get into more of a debate about CapEx in the 12 months leading up to an exit than you do in the first 12 months of a new deal.
Okay.
Right? Because that last 12 months worth of spend, like, you need to demonstrate to a new buyer that you've been operating the business as if it's long term. But anything you spend in that year, the private equity house and yourselves as shareholders as well will not materially get the benefit of. It'll be for the benefit of the next people. So there's a bit more debate there when you're into that last 12 months. But you can actually have the discussion, and it's just relative priorities. So first off, don't think you're in conflict. Secondly, articulate what is a must-do, what's the return on investment of the rest. And I'd say thirdly, do remind yourself that you're a steward of the business. And there might be some soft things around culture, around recruitment, around the way you treat people, who you recruit, who you exit, that again, you might need to keep an eye on, because that might not be exactly aligned with a tight plan to be in and out in 3 years.
Yeah, and I guess a smart buyer on the other side on that buyout will be watching for things. I think you talked last time about how you look at CapEx and where people are spending depending on the industry, so that you can see if you've got some massive investments to make.
Yeah, look, I think that's an argument for every CFO, is to say, look, the CapEx needs to happen because someone coming in to assess this business will spot that we haven't spent on the things that were absolutely necessary. But I think you've just got to use that language, and no one's going to disagree with you, right? It's just have that structured way of thinking and realize that there are some challenges in that last year of CapEx, and just make sure you lay out the plan in line with that. And there won't be a problem. You just got to make it clear. You can also, again, we talked about the corporate finance advisors. They can help you with establishing what market and industry norms are around some of this. And particularly on the CapEx, it's not the only thing, but it is a good example. What's the average level of CapEx out there in your sector? And if you're below that, more questions will come than if you're above that. And if you're above that, you as a CFO should be going, you yourself should be going, actually, I think, in the final year, we should actually be hitting the market average, not over-investing. That's probably what you should do. But it's never that simple. These things are always quite organic. So you go there with that framework of discussion, those sorts of priorities and that structure of language. You'll have a great discussion at the board and come out with the right answers, but you're not in conflict on it.
And what about level of involvement should you be expecting? We talked, in terms of as you go through the cycle, we talked about ultimately you do have control because you have accountability, but how will that level of control and input change as you go through that cycle?
Yeah, well, look, this is one of the areas where you could well argue there's some bad and some ugly, the good, the bad, and the ugly. but sometimes for good reason. So I, in previous lives, would regularly talk to managing teams that hadn't really seen their investor director for a period of time. And by that, possibly not even turning up to board meetings. Now, I don't think that would happen now. We were talking about 15 years ago, but that did used to happen. I think the equivalent now might be people just turning up for the board and not much dialogue in between times, or being difficult to get hold of for strategy days and things that the executive team want to do. Now, where you are in the cycle and how you are doing really influence the amount of attention an investor director should be bestowing upon you. And I'd encourage any team and CFO to think like this, which is, if you are doing really, really well and the investor director can't add anything, well, what do you want them to do? They need to stay informed, but you don't need help. They just need to stay informed. So that might be a very different number of hours to if you're actually only just about on plan and the investor director can really help you, like you've got a weakness in an area that they've got a strength, then they should be getting some more time. At that point, you then got to think and put yourself in the investor director's shoes to say, how many of the businesses are they on the board of? How many new deals are they doing? And just like any employment interaction, you've got to be aware of that, human about it, to say, look, sometimes, and also personal things as well, of course, but sometimes that person's going to get dragged into supporting their private equity firm with a new deal versus supporting you. So what's really important is that you get ahead of that and you have a plan, CFO with CEO or the whole of the exec together, about how are we going to get the best response out of our private equity house? And that is right. Like you don't have a right to attention, right? You should hope for some, but you don't have an absolute right for it. So how do you make the most of the time that you've got? How are you playing to strengths across the whole of the team? Are you planning far enough in advance to certainly have your board dates in, but also have your away days booked in well in advance, so that if that deal comes along that the investor director might be pulled across onto, that you've already defended that territory? It's like, well, we know that we've got them on the 15th of the month, and we can actually have that discussion as we need. And again, I'll jump back to something else you said in a previous episode. There are nearly always other people within a private equity house that have some involvement in your business, your investment. So what opportunity do you have to have access to them if your primary contact is busy? And obviously you do that all through the primary contact, but you need to have a plan for it. So I think the first thing is just knock the assumptions away, be realistic about things, have an open dialogue about it, and plan and be prepared, and you won't be disappointed. But you do have to go in knowing that at certain points in the cycle, if you're successful, particularly, you might not get as much attention as perhaps you were thinking you would get based on the deal process.
So I'm going to flip that around. If a lack of attention means that you're probably doing something well, is that always the case? Is there any times when a lack of attention could actually mean the opposite? So could actually mean that you're not registering on, I guess, their agenda, on their priority list. Is it something you should be worried about as well?
You've got to investigate it. So it can be that. So if you step back and look at where do private equity make their money, there are some rules of thumb there. So say you have 12 deals in a fund, you might have 2 stars. You might have 2 that either fail or only return the stake money. And then you'll have a whole bunch of companies that are somewhere in the middle. And it's in that middle that if you're one of those middle companies and you're not getting any attention, it could well be because the private equity house have thought, what could we do to improve the performance of this business by paying more attention? And they might have correctly or otherwise concluded more attention on business A will not lead to better performance. So actually what we end up doing is we will caretake business A, we'll manage it towards an exit, but we're now thinking it's going to do 2 times the money rather than 3 times, 4 times, or 5 times. So that's not bad, but it's obviously not as good as if you're smashing it and everyone's going, wow, there's nothing we can add to this team. It's different to that. And of course, that organization has to be thinking like that to an extent. Now, we as Sullivan, we set up differently. We deliberately set up so that actually we would pursue every avenue with every business because we like the alignment that brings between management teams and their motivations and our motivations. But, we are odd, if you like, in that. It's much more typical to have 12 deals, multiple funds. And so you've got this portfolio effect from the private equity house where they're having to think, our effort versus return. Okay, so you just need to think around that. And this is the reason that, again, a CFO have an understanding of what other CFOs in that fund, how they are doing. Talk to the investment director about how the rest of the portfolio is going. It's because it can have an impact on you. Now, I think this is at the edges. I don't think there are too many people that are negatively affected by this, but it is something that you should be aware of, being part of that executive team. Where do you sit in the pecking order within that fund? How much attention are you getting? And is that for good reasons or not? And again, I think you can have a reasonably open conversation with the investor director. And ultimately, if you're not getting attention and you'd like to have more, you've got to come up with a new plan. If you're in this middle and it's a bad type of low attention, what's the new plan? If you're going to that team and saying, actually, if you gave us a bit more capital, we could go on an M&A run. We could double the profit, and here's how we can do it. And we've de-risked it, we've thought this through, and we've talked to this business. That's really compelling, And then you'll flush out if that's at all a possibility, or if there's something like it that might work to take you out of the the doldrums or whatever that sort of slight stagnation that you get when you're in that middle ground.
And what are some of the signs that you're sitting in those two that are right at the bottom? What are the things that, as the CFO in a private equity-backed company, if you hear, see, or experience, that you should be concerned about?
I think if you're in the bottom two, you probably know, right? And it's not even necessarily the bottom two, and this is just on average, right? So it can be 1, it can be 3, it can be none. But it'll be that you're bumping along close to covenants.
Okay.
So your performance is close to meaning that the capital structure is not working. And that can be for all sorts of reasons, like market reasons, cash constraints because clients aren't paying you, lack of growth when you thought growth was going to come through quickly. And that last one means that you set covenants such that you allow for growth. And if the growth doesn't come, then, the bank starts to get more and more unhappy with you because they've made a bet on you based on that growth coming. So yeah, you'll feel it. You'll be close, and in that bottom two, you will get scrutiny from the private equity house. And what they might do is they might offer you initially more financial, like team support, like an interim financial controller or an interim FD to support your efforts, because at that point when you're close to covenant breach, what you can't afford is you can't afford any nasty surprises. So changes that you might have made in year 2, you actually have to make now in terms of getting the reporting to be accurate, because you can get to a point where one client loss, one delayed payment actually can be very damaging, and you end up in discussions with the banks as opposed to having a business that's surviving. So I think at the bottom 2 you typically know.
And we've talked a lot good, title of this podcast is The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, right? So what is the ugly bit of private equity that people don't necessarily know about till they get in?
Well, look, I think there's an amount that is known about, right? So I think there's an ugly that's understood and sometimes overplayed by the media. I mean, you never see a positive news story about private equity. Right? It always sounds like, 80s asset stripping or something like that, right? And anytime private equity gets involved in a sector, despite the efforts of various associations, it's not talking about productivity, performance, discipline, dynamism. It's often talking about cost cutting and damage to jobs and profiteering. And I would say this, but I don't think that's fair. But I think that's some of the ugly, because look, to an extent that any business is looking for opportunities, and any business can be deemed to be a bad business with fat cats at the top, differentials, lack of fairness, and all sorts. And so you can make those arguments, and I think you've got to watch for some of that ugly, if you're in the business, and say a private equity house might come in and say, well, why can't we push price up 10%? And the answer might be you can for 12 months, but those relationships will never recover. Clients may never forgive you for doing it. And again, back to some of this like short-term, long-term, they might be right that you can push 10% on the price, but there'll be some trade-off for it. So that sometimes can be exactly the right thing to do. And again, we've walked in situations where the economic model for the business is not working. And unless you do some of those things, the business will fail. The business is not on a sustainable footing. So in that case, it's very different. Like, you have to do some of those things. You have to transform. But yeah, I think that's one of the uglies. Another ugly I'd state, and I don't know how often this comes about, is because you've often got a world of people who are, very financially literate in private equity, and they've been in investment businesses and so on. You sometimes need to manage their understanding of the day-to-day in a company and the interrelation of people. And just practicalities, like if someone's off on, some form of bereavement leave, or if there's something going on with an individual in your senior team, it might not be the first place that some investor directors would go in terms of understanding. And I think once it's explained, there's hardly anybody in the space that's like wouldn't acknowledge it. It's a factor. But I do think because of the different sets of priorities, because of where people are in the governance structure, you do need to remind investment-led people about that side of things. And that can be really powerful because you can remind them about it in terms of incentives and like, I think there's more we can do. This is a great positive. But also when like there are trips and fails and things are going a bit wrong with an individual in your team, you have to keep a hold on that and you have to vouch for them on those things. And so some of the ugly can be, if you don't have that discussion, it can be seen that private equity is overly calculating, overly cold to some of those human relationships and arrangements. And it will be different by every individual and different by every house. But actually your job as the CFO and the exec team is to communicate what you think is the right thing to do. And if you're aware of some human factors that need to be brought to the table, bring them to the table. Because that's your skill set, not necessarily the private equity houses.
You know what, Rich, there's been some really great insights and I've loved this episode. So a couple of things just to shout out. I loved we started the conversation and ended it in a similar place. We started talking about not to forget where you came from. Remember to go down and look down as well as looking up within an organization. And then I think we finished on that same cultural note, which is don't forget the personal side of running a business and be that advocate for your team and your people within that private equity space. So what a great way to finish this episode. And thank you, Rich, as always, for sharing some amazing insights into the world of the good, the bad, the ugly of private equity.
Absolutely. There's plenty of good. So everybody's reminded, plenty of good, lots of dynamic decision making and all of that. But you can help affect the bad and the ugly from your seat as CFO.
And if you have enjoyed this episode, then don't forget to join our next one, which is all about the Mythbusters. So one of them, we're going to unpick some of those myths that sit around private equity and get more into the external view of private equity and perhaps how it's not quite how it seems to be. So thank you for joining us on this episode and look forward to seeing you on the next one.
Now, for the £1 million question. What is the best finance software for your business? Is it A, Sage 50? Is it B, Sage 200 Standard? C, Sage 200 Professional? Or D, Sage Intact? An impossible question to answer without a lifeline. But we have the perfect lifeline for you. Our free quiz, Which Sage Product is Right for You, will tell you which product is the best fit for your business in just 5 minutes. All you need to do is head to www.itassolutions.co.uk and answer a few simple questions.